coincidence that we're going to be sort of expanding more into much deeper connections from looking at kind of micro-classification and macro-classification. So the title of my talk is Sino-Tibetan related to Ket and Na-Dené, and how should we evaluate macrofamilies? So I'm not going to be focusing specifically that much on Sino-Tibetan, Ket, and Na-Dené. It's more of a methodological presentation with a case study. So, as most of you probably know from taking the linguistics courses, the discovery of the comparative method has allowed us to classify languages in a falsifiable manner and reconstruct proto-languages. And now, according to Lyle Campbell, there are 406 language isolates and families, and most non-isolates have reconstructable proto-languages, but not all of them. And in the 20th century, it became way more common with people like Joseph Greenberg to compare proto-languages and try to establish higher level groupings. So a macro family is one of these higher level groupings. It's when you have more than one well-established language family in this hypothetical genetic grouping. So we're not talking specifically about instances of language contact or a Schwarzschild type of effect. We're talking more about actual genetic groups. Some of them are plausible. So a lot of people think that Kra-Dai is related to Austronesian, for example. But most of them are considered unlikely or impossible to prove. There are also cases where well-accepted families have been called macrofamilies, for example, Afroasiatic. And the term might be superfluous because how macro do you have to get for something to be a macrofamily, right? There's no clear demarcation. And the big difference that I've seen is that many macrofamilies have relied on mass comparison, which is a different methodology than the traditional comparative method. And we can mostly thank Joseph Greenberg for that. So what he used to do is he used to take tables of basic vocabulary and then essentially assert that languages are related when they show numerous similarities in these items. Now, evidently there are problems with this. So for example, there's this widely held belief that if languages have similar looking pronouns or numerals that they're related. This is not true. So Komi has borrowed one of its words for he from Russian. Piraha has borrowed all of its pronouns from an unrelated Tupian language. And Proto-Tai borrowed almost all of its numerals from Middle Chinese. So these things are not necessarily methodologically secure ways to classify languages. We also know that in many cases, similar looking roots are often indistinguishable from random distribution. As in there are not that many more similar looking roots, or there are not more at all, from a completely random sample. So Ringe showed this for Nostratic in 1985, and that was the paper that essentially put the nail in the coffin for that theory. And oftentimes when there are more than sort of just a random distribution of roots, of similar looking roots, it appears that these are due to irregular sound correspondences or implausible semantic comparison, right? There's going to be lookalikes because the human mouth can only produce a small number of sounds, and many languages that we compare tend to have smaller phoneme inventories. For example, like if you're comparing Austronesian and Kra-Dai, the phoneme inventory is not that big compared to, for example, Northwest Caucasian. And we're stuck with reconstructions of reconstructions. So no single reconstruction that we have has a confidence level of 100%, and oftentimes specific phonemes are important for the analysis of the probability of a sound change. So I'm going to give you an example. If Proto-XN seems to correspond to Proto-YS in 4 lexemes, it's less likely to be a cognate than if Proto-X-sh corresponds to Proto-YS in 4 lexemes. So let's say there's an original Proto-XY sh sound, which became a sh and an s. That requires way less auxiliary hypotheses than any possible common ancestor of Proto-X and an s. I mean, I don't even know what phoneme that would be the ancestor of those. You could probably come up with one, but the point is you have to have a lot of individual stages, right? Whereas we have attested in the historical period a sound change from like a palato-alveolar fricative sh to an s. So if you can imagine a proto-language A that has 60% confidence in the reconstruction, and a proto-language B that has 70%, if you're trying to reconstruct proto-AB, these are largely independent, right? So you're not reconstructing them with the idea in mind that they're related to each other, because that's a circular argument. So you multiply the probabilities, and you get the proto-language C, or the reconstruction of C, has a 42% confidence level, which is way below what we want. So we need to be very confident in our reconstructions to be confident in our reconstructions of reconstructions. It doesn't mean that the probability of the existence of C is 42%, but it means that the reconstruction of the reconstruction is 42%. So figuring out these sound correspondences obviously depends on finding similar looking words, and if the confidence level of a certain segment is even low, and this part of the relationship is dependent upon the segment, then the confidence level in the higher level proto-language should also be low. So if you have Proto-C, K-Pa, which, for example, is the ancestor of A, K-Wa, and B, Che-Pa, looks plausible, right? But if we're uncertain about the K from Proto-A, then we don't know if these are cognates, right? We have a much lower confidence level if these are actually cognates, unless we can establish that that K is almost certain. So because of this, we would be resulted with a lower number of lexemes with a high confidence to establish sound correspondences. Maybe there's not enough. And every language experiences a lot of semantic drift over time. Over a long enough period, it can completely obscure cognates, and typically a lot of people who are into these kinds of classifications use what I call narrative semantics, where they come up with a story about how one word became something without substantiating it. So for example, Nikolaev thinks that Proto-Algonquin Wakashan Olma, meaning angry, became Proto-Wakashan Niv meaning bad luck. Now you can make up a story for that, but how plausible is the story, right? There's also Jackson Crawford's hamburger program, or problem, not program. I would like to go to a hamburger program. So borrowing can lead to the rapid development of new morphology. This is something that Jackson Crawford, the YouTuber, has mentioned in one of his videos. Imagine an alien with no knowledge of German saw the word nothing burger in English. Would they know that burger is a suffix that involves the rebracketing, or historically involved the rebracketing of Hamburger, something from Hamburg, and that Berg meant castle? Almost certainly not, right? And these hamburger problems pile up over time. Imagine how many burger morphemes from extinct languages are present in the entire history of every language family that we know. This is a huge skeptical challenge to long-range macrofamilies, but I still think that this is not entirely insurmountable. So shared irregularities can often point to a relationship, although irregular morphology can be borrowed. So a lot of languages that borrow from Arabic have borrowed Arabic irregular plurals, for example. And if Arabic didn't exist, we would probably think these are reconstructible to the proto-language, right? So the best way to do it is just to find regular sound correspondences. But you need to have enough vocabulary, and if you don't, you need to find regular sound correspondences in morphemes. But this also assumes there are enough local-like morphemes. So we're going to look at a case study now. We're going to look at Sino-Tibetan, or whatever you want to call it. So there's a guy named Anton Schiefner, who was an ethnologist of Siberia in 1856. He argued that a language called Ket, which is the only surviving Yeniseian language right now, at this time there were more, might be related to the Sino-Tibetan language family, which includes Burmese, Tibetan, Chinese, and a bunch of other languages. Ket is a tonal language. It has many monosyllabic morphemes and a templatic prefixing verb with postpositions, which if anybody here is familiar with like Jaco Gyalrong or Kiranti language, no, okay, anyway. Is very similar to those languages. And there are some authors now giving increased attention to this Sino-Yeniseian hypothesis. So, for example, these are some of his roots. He thinks that Proto-Sino-Tibetan Ma, and for the record, we're going to assume that his reconstructions are correct. I don't think they are for other reasons, but we're just going to assume for the sake of argument that these are correct reconstructions of Proto-Sino-Tibetan. So he thinks that Ma and Ket Bun are related, and notably Proto-Athabascan, which is a lower level reconstruction of Na-Dené, not including all of the languages in the family, has this E, which I don't know why he put this here, because this is obviously not related, or not demonstrably related. And then he has some similar looking morphemes. But again, we have to establish why does this S correspond to a lateral fricative in the valency increasing morpheme, but to H in the nominalizer. And then why is there U to E, Sino-Tibetan U to Athabascan E? And why does this nominalizer from Athabascan become a prefix when it's a suffix in the other two languages? Prefixes becoming suffixes takes an extremely long time, unless it's an independent word originally, which would also make proving this more difficult, right? So we have some other issues here. He appears to have found, or thinks that he's found, a correspondence between initial velar nasals in Sino-Tibetan and then a uvular stop in Ket. But evidently there are problems here. For example, the word for sun, there's no correspondence between the velar nasal and the uvular. It's just a null initial. For wrinkled, there's no uvular stop at all. And the big problem is the vowels, right? So the vowels don't correspond very well. The word for evil has an A, in Ket it has an E, but then the other forms have an A to A. And also we know that the Ket word for eagle is dak, and the word for eagle's nest is dakai. The word for squirrel is sak and sakai. So this is clearly not derived from a word looking anything like a vowel, because I is a suffix meaning nest, which makes the relationship more difficult. This is often a problem with people who focus on macrofamilies because they tend to study so many languages that they don't learn any one language at a very deep level. So here he has a bunch of other ones which appear to be lookalikes. We could spend a long time, finding problems with this, but I think just to mention, I talked about the semantic drift earlier. Is the general word for water becoming snow plausible? I genuinely don't know, but Ket is originally from an area where there were 4 seasons, and water is pretty much present all the time, and snow is only present in a very short period, well, relatively long period of the year in Siberia, but not the entire year. And I've never seen this semantic drift happen in another language before. And then this is another thing I wanted to mention. So oftentimes when you have these sorts of proposals, people will say, oh, this is actually the same root, it was just metaphysized. However, as we're going to learn later, invoking metaphysis as an explanation without internally motivated factors presupposes a relationship, because it assumes that the two roots were originally similar when we don't actually know if they were, right? So this is a completely circular argument. Other sound changes need to be secure first. I will say though, the word for up and down in Sino-Tibetan and Athabascan are shockingly similar. It could just be a coincidence though. And then here's some other sound changes or sound correspondences in numerals, which, as you can see, are not very convincing. Maybe 1 or 2 of them are, interesting, but not really. So, has Bradley proved Sino-Tibetan? I think definitely not. He doesn't have any regular sound correspondences. Too many exceptions. The best sound correspondences are Sino-Tibetan D and Ket D. Sino-Tibetan Eng and Ket, voiceless Euro cut, and then N and N. But there's no consonant pair with more than 4 matches, and most have much less. Ringe has shown that you need more than 7 matches in 100 words for a consonant to have a 99% confidence level that the distribution is not a result of chance, which again does not mean that there's a relationship, but it means that maybe you can suspect borrowing or something. And we can only say there's a sound correspondence at high confidence. Maybe you don't need 99, but the important thing to keep in mind is that these scales go down logarithmically. So as we reduce the number of similar consonants, the confidence level doesn't go down a little bit, it starts going down a lot. And there's a selection effect because Bradley has chosen roots that look similar, so when you take ones that don't look similar, you probably get something very similar to random variation. So, are Ket and Sino-Tibetan related? They might be. Probably there was only a few times that language emerged in the history of humanity, so maybe all languages or most languages are related, but we can't prove it. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but most of these language founding proposals, are kind of